We have quite a few who have been exposed, at least one member of a family, and so they are, a couple of different families are staying home this morning. That's why they're not here. Got a couple of members that are not feeling well, and so out of an abundance of caution, they're staying home. We have had one member in the congregation test positive in the past week. However, that individual had been isolating going back a week just out of precaution, and so we're thankful for that. Just from my perspective, I think folks here have handled this very, very responsibly. And I know we all get frustrated sometimes when we can't all be together, but we understand why that is right now, and certainly we appreciate everyone exercising good judgment and trying to make sure everyone is taken care of. All right, Mark chapter 2. We did not finish up. I didn't think we would. We didn't finish up last week. Let's review the questions that we had that started off. Hey, Glenn, will you hit that middle light switch while you're right there? Thank you. Let's review our questions. What statement did Jesus make that caused such a stir there in Capernaum? Do you remember? Yeah, son, your sins are forgiven you. That's right. What is the point of Jesus, which is easier question? Which is easier to say to the paralyzed man, rise, take up your bed and walk, or your sins are forgiven? Doesn't matter, right? He makes use of both statements so that there's no doubt whatsoever about the power and authority that he possessed. How does Mark record Jesus referring to himself in chapter 2 and verse 10? Yeah, here he's the Son of Man, right? That would certainly serve to emphasize his humanity and his servanthood. Why did Jesus eat and drink with the tax collectors and sinners? Yeah, he came to tend to the spiritually sick, right? And so, wherever the spiritually sick are that he's going to be able to help, that's where he is going, and that's to whom he's going to be tending. What was so bad about being a tax gatherer? Yeah, they were thought of as being cheats, as being thieves. They were viewed as an arm of Rome. And so this, of course, is all going to add in to the confusion when Jesus calls whom to follow him? Matthew, who is a tax collector. That's right. And then what should you not put in old wineskins? New wine. Why would you not put new wine into old wineskins? That's one possibility, yeah. Right. Yeah, split them open, right, with the chemical processes that are going on in there. So you would put new wine into what? A new wineskin, and putting new wine into a new wineskin would do what? Would preserve that wine and keep it from what? Keep it from fermenting and keep it from turning into what? Not only might it turn into alcohol, it also might turn into basically what? Vinegar, right. And so putting it into that new wineskin would do that. All right. So we talked just briefly about this, some of the things that are going on consistent with Mark chapter 2, or perhaps that have already happened. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus calming the sea, the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, and Jesus' conversation there with Nicodemus. Jesus calls Levi or Matthew to follow him. We talked about the reasons that he would have to do that and the reasons he would have not to do that. Jesus goes then into Matthew's house. He sits down and shares a meal there, and the Pharisees are all upset about that because Jesus is eating with whom? Tax collectors and sinners. But was Jesus granting his approval to the lives that they were leading? No. In fact, Jesus identifies them as being in need of what? Of a physician, right? He is there to do what? Heal them, to help them. That's right. He's not there giving his approval to the various lifestyles that they might have been leading. Is Jesus calling the Pharisees righteous when he said, I did not come to call those who are healthy, but those who are sick?
I think he was acknowledging the fact that they thought they were righteous.
Absolutely. How did the Pharisees view themselves?
as righteous. They viewed themselves as being full and not in need of anything. And if you don't think you're sick, where are you not going to go? You only go to the doctor when? I know we've got checkups and everything, but when do you go to the doctor primarily? When you're sick, right? If they don't view themselves as sick, then what? They're not going to go where? They're not going to go to the doctor. That's right. All right, chapter 2 and verse 18. Why did John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? Stephen, how many feasts were required under the law of Moses?
How many
Fasts, sorry.
Just the one.
I was about to mess with you on that one, how many feasts. You're about to have to do some counting, right? Fast, right. There's only one fast that was required under the law of Moses, and Stephen, that was the fast that was associated with what? The Day of Atonement, right. That's Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 31. So when we are here in Mark chapter 2, was there any indication at all that this is the Day of Atonement? No, I'm sorry, I have got like a eyelash in my eye and it is bothering me. I hope that got it. You don't want to see me up here doing this the whole class, do you? All right, every indication is that this is not then the Day of Atonement. So the Pharisees have transitioned from complaining about Jesus eating to now complaining about Jesus' disciples not eating. If the disciples are violating anything, what are they violating? Tradition. The traditions of whom? Of the Pharisees. Are they violating the law of Moses? No. Are they then guilty before God? No. The only people before whom they might be guilty are the Pharisees, because the Pharisees had created all of these little hedge-type laws to make sure that you didn't violate the law of Moses in their mind. They created these additional laws. The thinking being, if you stay within the confines of these laws, then you certainly won't do what? Then you certainly won't stray outside and break the law of Moses. Of course, you see throughout the New Testament how well that turned out for them. But to the deeper question here, as you're looking at chapter 2 and verse 19, why do your disciples not fast? Jesus said to them, while the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom do not fast, do they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, otherwise the patch pulls away from it. The new from the old, and a worse tear results. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. All right. Yes, Jeff.
They were eating.
Pardon?
They're not fasting. That's the point. Jesus' disciples are not fasting.
They're not fasting.
You have it.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I do up there, don't I? They were not fasting. That's right.
Because John's people were and Jesus weren't. And it's like,
The only time that they would have been, and this is what I was trying to say, you're right, I have it wrong up there. The only time they would have been compelled to fast would have been at the Day of Atonement. Since this is not the Day of Atonement, there was no spiritual requirement for them to fast. Whereas the Pharisees had created this kind of altered schedule where a fast was. You go back and read some of the Jewish writings of this time, and it seems like there were some sects of the Pharisees who were requiring people to fast 2 times a week for a day. And so that's kind of what their law, the Pharisees' law, had morphed into. So why are they not fasting? What is Jesus' positive answer to that? Why are they not fasting? The bridegroom is with them. Well, what's that all about?
He's bigger than fasting.
He's bigger than fasting.
it would be kind of insulting to go to a wedding party and not eat anything.
If you're going to a wedding and you're making this big show of fasting, what does that indicate?
You're not happy.
You're not happy. You're not comfortable with the events. They might not ask if anyone has any objections. Speak now, forever hold your peace. But instead of doing that, if you're there at the dinner and they're serving cake and everything, and you're like, "Oh no, I'm fasting. I'm in mourning." What would that communicate? You don't approve of the events that are happening, right? They're not fasting while the bridegroom is with them. And of course, in Jesus' picture here, who is the bridegroom? He is, right? And he is with them, so is it appropriate for them to fast at this time? No, it's not appropriate for them to fast at this time because they had the bridegroom with them. It was not appropriate for the disciples to fast because it was not appropriate to vouch for the Pharisees' traditions. If Jesus tells them to go on and fast, what might that look like? That they're bowing the knee to whom? To the Pharisees and their traditions and their hedge laws. And that is the very thing that Jesus is arguing against here. And then the bigger picture here is that Jesus has not come to join two covenants together. Jesus is not here joining together the old and the new. Because if you try to join together the old and the new, what happens? It pulls apart and creates a greater tear, or it does what to the wineskin? It bursts it. So instead of joining the old to the new, what does Jesus come to do? To bring in a new covenant. Not to lay it down over top and kind of meld the two together, but he's bringing in a new covenant. Was he right to do that? Was that appropriate to talk about a new covenant? Why? Yeah, go to Jeremiah chapter 31. Look at Jeremiah chapter 31. This is in fact the very thing that God had prophesied through the prophets in the Old Covenant. Jeremiah 31, come over to verse 31. Jeremiah 31:31, "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them." What covenant is he talking about here that God made with the people when he brought them out of Egypt? Do you remember that story? They come out of Egypt, and where do they go? Mount Sinai. And what covenant is established there? Law of Moses, right? You get the story of the Ten Commandments and all of the other laws that were given. There's that covenant, but that is which covenant here? The old or the new? Old, because something new is coming and it's going to be different than that covenant. Verse 33, "This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, they shall be my people. No more shall every man teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more." There in verse 34, "No man shall ever teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they all shall know me." What was the most common way you were brought into the Old Covenant? By birth. By birth. Right? So you were born into that covenant, and then what had to happen? There in verse 34. You had to be taught. Is the new covenant going to be like that? What's going to happen first under the new covenant? You're going to be taught. And then what? Then you're born into that covenant. All right? So when Jesus talks about not melding the old and the new together, but rather just fundamentally bringing in a new, he is speaking consistently with what is found in the Old Testament scriptures, right? That's just exactly what Jeremiah had spoken of. All right, any questions down through verse 22? Rebecca. Oh, go for it.
Okay, he said they had the bridegroom.
Mm-hmm.
John's apostles, disciples had come, and they were fasting.
Mm-hmm.
John had said he was a friend of the bridegroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so that John's disciples could associate this is the Messiah, this is the
Mhm.
appointed one. And then in Hosea, and I don't remember the exact verse,
Oh,
God says, I will be a husband
yeah.
to Israel.
Mhm.
And so in essence, Christ is saying, I am God. They are
Yes.
God with me,
Mhm.
with them.
And that's one thing that you're going to pick up on as you start going through the gospel accounts more and more. How many of these statements that Jesus makes that on the surface might not appear to be much of anything, but when you dig down into them, they become claims of his divinity. One thing you're mentioning there, Rebecca, is from John chapter 3. Just so you know, this afternoon's Bible study on YouTube is from John chapter 3. And we pull out some of those points right there, how Jesus, some of these statements that on the surface just seem to be, just kind of there, there's nothing to them, actually end up being fundamental claims for who he is, that he is God, that he is divine. And so, yeah, there's a lot to see there.
Well,
Corey?
I was thinking about when you read verses 19 through 22 earlier, and when he was talking about the bridegroom, I was thinking, of all the people, and I know we've said this before, the Pharisees, all these people should have recognized who he was, but you had that pride issue, and the fact that they would have to admit that they were wrong, that they should have seen, should have recognized who he was, but yet the pride aspect stood in their way. and
Sure.
it's a sad thing.
Sure. Jeff?
Jesus is the master of simple statements and questions that nobody wants answered.
Yeah.
Let him who is without sin cast the first stone.
Right. Very simple statements on the surface, but have a lot of depth and to them. That's a good point. All right, let's get down to verse 23. And verses 23 through 28 should take us to the end of class here. Verse 23, it came about that as he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, that his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "See here, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So just pause real quick. We have gone from complaining about Jesus eating to complaining about the disciples not eating. Now guess what the complaint is going to be? The disciples are eating. You will never please some people. And that's just the fact of the matter. So keep reading. The Pharisees were saying to him, "See here, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath, picking the heads of grain and eating them?" And Jesus said to them, verse 25, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered into the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he gave it also to those who were with him. And he was saying to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Consequently, the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." I'm going to admit to you right now, I'm probably not going to have every answer to every question you might have on this, because I'm still sorting through some of it myself. I think this is a really, really deep text here. But let's try to break some of this down. The Pharisees shifted their tactic, like we said. Now they're going to complain about Jesus' disciples eating. So let's start right there. Okay? What day of the week is this? Sabbath. Okay. Question number 1, was eating on the Sabbath sinful?
No,
Could you eat on the Sabbath?
yes.
Vanessa, could you eat on the Sabbath? Rebecca says yes.
You had to prepare it before.
You had to prepare it before. But yeah, you could eat on the Sabbath. Go back to Exodus chapter 6. Stephen, I'll get to you in just a moment. Come back to Exodus chapter 16. As we come out of Egypt, what is God going to give to the Israelites to make sure that they're fed? Manna. How often did the manna come?
6 days.
6 days a week. It did not come on the Sabbath. But what were you supposed to do on the day before the Sabbath? Collect 2 times as much to hold you over through the Sabbath when there would be no manna that fell, right? Could you eat that manna on the Sabbath? Yeah. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 25. Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none." Now it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, and they found none. You weren't supposed to go out and gather on the Sabbath, but what could you do? Verse 25, you could eat it on the Sabbath, right? So the problem here is not eating on the Sabbath. All right, Stephen, what did you want to add in?
That was where I was going.
Okay, good stuff. All right. So, let's come to this then. What food-related restrictions were there on the Sabbath?
Well, you can't work on the Sabbath.
Okay, that's where we need to define a word, don't we? What does it mean to work? Because by the strictest definition, you breathing is what? Work. It's the expenditure of energy, right? So what kind of work was forbidden? And I know that's not what you meant, Jeff. We're just working through it. What kind of work were you forbidden from doing?
Give you gain.
Work that would give you gain.
Hard work.
Hard work, travel. Go back to our example in Exodus chapter 16. What kind of work could you not do? Gathering, right? Harvesting. Couldn't do that. Could you go about and thresh in a field? I used the word thresh, so that would be an indicator of what? No. Look at Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34. Corey, could you eat bacon on the Sabbath? Nope. Couldn't eat bacon any day. Sad. Yeah. Look at Exodus chapter 34, verse 21. 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. So that helps us understand the kind of work that is going to be forbidden here. The work of planting, the work of harvesting, the work of threshing, those are all works that you could not do. Could you pull a donkey out of a ditch? Yes, you could. All right. Jesus is going to explain that later in the Gospels, all right? So it's not as easy as saying you can't do anything on the Sabbath. Because there were things you could do. But there are specific things you could not do, and that's what's coming into play here. The law of Moses was clear. Exodus 34, you could not plant, you could not harvest. Okay? Jeff, did you want to add something in?
Well, in Exodus 20, in the original law,
Uh-huh.
the verses go from 8 through 11, and I think that it's primarily directed against avarice
Yeah.
and also against oppression,
Yes.
because everybody who wants more money would want to work their people every single day.
Right.
Never give them any time.
Sure.
And he's giving everybody 1 day out of the week to rest up for the other 6.
Mm-hmm.
And some people don't care about rest, they care more about money.
Yeah.
But this is supposed to be the day you think about God, and you give people a chance to recuperate.
Yeah. And if you read in some alternate translations, they're going to insert the word there, common work, which is going to cover your idea of sowing, threshing, planting, harvesting, things like that. But pulling your oxen out of the ditch that broke its leg, that's not common work. That's not falling under that heading there. But Jeff, your point is well taken, right? I think there's a lot here about the Sabbath, especially where it's placed here within the Ten Commandments, to communicate to us this is out of a concern for the well-being of man. I think Jesus is going to add to that here in Mark 2. So you couldn't plant, you couldn't harvest. Those are the big restrictions that are going to come into play here in Mark chapter 2. So you couldn't plant, you couldn't harvest, you could eat. So what are the Pharisees going to accuse Jesus' disciples of doing here in Mark chapter 2? When you're picking the heads of grain, that's what? Harvesting, and you're rubbing it between your hands, that's what? Work, that's grinding, right? They're saying, well, they're violating the Sabbath. They're threshing, they're harvesting, they're grinding, all works that are forbidden on the Sabbath day. You going along with that logic?
I don't even know who owns this cornfield.
Well, let's notice this. Come over to Deuteronomy chapter 23. The Old Testament law recognized a difference between harvesting and what we just might colloquially call snacking. Okay? Look at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23, and come down here to verse 24. When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any into your container. When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, that's what we have with the disciples. You may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain. What could you do in your neighbor's field and vineyard? You could snack. What could you not do? You could not harvest their field. That makes sense, doesn't it? Right? You have a row of apple trees, crab apple trees out in your front yard. Somebody's walking by. If we're living under the law of Moses, what could they do? Hey, I'm hungry. I could pluck a crab apple out, peel it, and eat it. Yeah. What could I not do? Bring my 5-gallon bucket along, fill it up, take those crab apples home, and make a pie and jelly or something like that. You couldn't harvest. But you could pluck a crab apple off. You could peel some grapes off and do what? Eat them, and that was completely fine. That's going to explain later in the New Testament where Jesus is walking along and he sees a fig tree. It's not his house, but he gets excited because what? He can go pull a couple figs off and eat. That was allowed under the law of Moses. That was fine. Okay? So are the disciples violating the law of Moses here? They are doing what is allowed under the law of Moses. There is a difference between harvesting and snacking. So did the disciples do anything wrong by eating the heads of grain in the field? Are they harvesting? Are they threshing? Are they grinding? No. What are they doing? Snacking, eating, which was what? Which was allowed, explicitly allowed under the law of Moses. So if they've done anything wrong, it's only in whose eyes? It's only in the eyes of the Pharisees. It's not in the eyes of God. Let's read this again. Verse 23. His disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain, and the Pharisees were saying to him, "See here, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Were they violating the Sabbath? Okay, no. Now let's listen to Jesus explain this more fully. And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered into the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and he gave it also to those who were with him." Okay, so in further responding to the Pharisees, Jesus is going to invoke this story of David. Come back to 1 Samuel chapter 21. 1 Samuel chapter 21. This is the story of this episode. 1 Samuel chapter 21. So what is this, first off, what is this consecrated bread? It was bread that was given to the priests for their sustenance. What was the name of this bread? Showbread, or shewbread, that's right, showbread. The text talks about going into the house of God. What house of God would this have been? Tabernacle, right. Temple hasn't been built yet. Who's going to build the temple? Solomon. Who is Solomon in relation to David? His son. So Solomon's not in the picture yet. We don't have the temple yet. We're talking now about the tabernacle. And the showbread, which would have been there in the temple, primarily for whom? For the priests, right? Here in 1 Samuel chapter 21, David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" So David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found.' And the priest answered David and said, 'There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women.' Then David answered the priest and said to him, 'Truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy. And the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day.' So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away." So it's kind of interesting how the showbread operated. It talks about the hot bread being placed there. You would have, I think it was 2 stacks of 6 loaves, we'll call it that, of this showbread that would have been set on this table in the tabernacle. And the bread would sit there for 7 days. On the 7th day, you would then take that bread out, put new bread out there, and what do you do with the bread that you took away? Throw it in the trash? The priests are given it. Okay? And we're not talking about like, little bitty, little Debbie banana loaves or anything like that. You're talking about good-sized bread, and that's going to the priest to sustain them. That's given to them as part of their payment for their work, okay? So that is the bread that Ahimelech is talking with David about here, and the bread that he is going to give to David, okay? So in general, what is the rule concerning the showbread? We've kind of talked about this already. What was the general rule about the showbread? It's for the priest. Now here's my question to you. Was the showbread only ever for the priests? Because that sometimes is the answer. Well, the showbread was only for whom? The priest. Is that true? And the fact that I'm asking you the question would indicate what? Come with me to the book of Leviticus. Come back to the book of Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, in chapter 24. Leviticus chapter 24, and verse 5. The general rule is that this showbread is for the priests. You shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake. You shall set them in 2 rows, 6 on a row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. And you shall put pure frankincense on each row, that it may be on the bread for a memorial, an offering made by fire to the Lord. Every Sabbath he shall set it in order before the Lord continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons that they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him from the offerings of the Lord made by fire by a perpetual statute. So the general rule is that when it's removed from the temple, it's there for the priests to eat. But look at chapter 22. It's not as easy as saying the showbread was only for the priests. Because guess what the law of Moses does? It provides for some moments when that showbread could be eaten by people other than, guess whom? Other than the priest. Look at Leviticus chapter 22 and verse 10. No outsider shall eat the holy offering. One who dwells with the priest or a hired servant shall not eat the holy thing. We're talking about the showbread there. So there is the general rule stated. The general rule is what? Showbread is only for the priest, but keep reading, verse 11. But if the priest buys a person with his money, he may eat it, and one who is born in his house may eat his food. If the priest's daughter is married to an outsider, she may not eat of the holy offerings. But if the priest's daughter is a widow or divorced and has no child, and has returned to her father's house as in her youth, she may eat her father's food. but no outsider shall eat it. Okay? So was it just as easy as the bread is only for the priests? No. So there were some exceptions to this rule that a priest was the only one to eat of the showbread. Now, here's something else. And Jeff, I think we mentioned this last week. Look at Leviticus chapter 2 real quick. Leviticus chapter 2 and verse 1. Sometimes in the Old Covenant, in the Old Law, any sustenance that you eat could be called meat, even if it was bread. Okay, Leviticus chapter 2, verse 1, when anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. He shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. He shall bring it to Aaron's son, the priest, one of whom shall take from it his handful of fine flour and oil with all the frankincense, and the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering shall be Aaron and his sons. It is most holy of the offerings to the Lord made by fire. And if you bring as an offering a grain offering baked in the oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. But if your pan offering is a grain offering baked in a pan, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil. That's the New King James Version. Jeff, does yours say meat? Leviticus 2, 1 through 5? Bobby, you're reading from the King James. I think the King James uses that word meat as well. Sometimes in the law of Moses, meat refers not just to animal flesh, but it's also going to refer just to anything that is eaten. So I think they're really, getting back to Mark 2, you've got really two approaches. When Jesus says David entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. I think you've got two possibilities here. Number one is that Jesus is stating the general rule of Leviticus 24. And the general rule was what? Only for the priests. Okay? And in this case, what's happening is Jesus would be encouraging a deeper examination of the law of Moses. That there were times when someone other than a priest was permitted to eat the showbread. The other approach that I see is that Jesus is affirming that what David did was wrong. And if that's the case, then Jesus is pointing out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees in attempting to rebuke his disciples while completely ignoring their hero's error. They're going to get on to Jesus and his disciples for simply breaking a Pharisaical code and not the law of Moses, but they're going to completely overlook who? David and his sin. And do they do this quite frequently? Right? They're going to come down really hard on the sexually immoral, the harlots, the prostitutes, but then they're going to give David a pass with whom? With Bathsheba. There's an inconsistency here. Jeff?
Okay, I have a third theory.
Okay. All right.
All right, so David was the anointed of God
Mhm.
to be the king of Israel.
Mhm.
Jesus is the anointed of God to be the king of the kingdom.
Mhm.
Jesus is the bread of life.
Mhm.
The showbread was a type of the true bread, who is Jesus. And those who follow Jesus in his kingdom will be priests. And I think that Jesus is just saying, I am God. I am the bread. I am the guy who's going to establish the new priesthood, and these are going to be my priests, not you. And so to me, that's the whole point.
Yeah, I think there is a point to be made there, Jeff. I think you're right about Jesus fundamentally asserting who he is, and that's what he's going to get at there at the very end when he's going to talk about the Son of Man being the Lord of the Sabbath. I think that's the point. I'm just more trying to explain this phrase right here, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, because that can get kind of tricky. But your point is well taken, Rebecca.
Well, only the priest, or someone in the priest's immediate family. It's never recommended anybody outside the priest's family can eat it.
Or someone that he bought.
Or he bought it, which would still be considered part of his family
Mhm.
Not man for the Sabbath.
Mhm.
David did not go in with the intention as the man say, give me the showbread.
Right,
I'm going to be king and I want the showbread.
right.
He went in very humbly. He asked for food,
Mhm.
any food. What they had was the showbread.
Mhm.
He was doing it under an emergency, kind of like taking the oxen out of the ditch.
Yeah.
Broken its leg. It's an emergency. You're doing good on the Sabbath. Mercy would probably have precedence over strict law keeping.
I agree. I don't know that I would phrase it necessarily that way. I think what we might be seeing is that there's more to the law of Moses than maybe what was revealed simply in these couple of passages. Because we know we don't have the entirety of everything that God ever communicated laid down here. But your point that mercy triumphs over judgment and things like that is certainly a well-founded tenet that we're seeing in Scripture. That's a good point, Rebecca. Stephen.
Yeah, I think I was going in the same direction of, the question arises, here is the food that the priest has. Is the priest allowed to share as an act of charity?
Sure.
And no, he's not allowed to use it for his own aggrandizement, for his own family and so on. But that's not the same thing as sharing with someone in need.
And I think that is something then that the writer of 1 Samuel is trying to clue us in on. Go back to 1 Samuel 21 just real quickly, and then we'll be done with this point. Did you notice that, is it Ahimelech here in 1 Samuel 21? Do you notice that Ahimelech asks a question? What question does he ask? Yeah, are the young men holy? Are they pure? He's making sure that they're not unclean. It's as if Ahimelech knows that he would have been authorized to share as long as these people were what?
Not ceremonially defiled.
Exactly. And so David then puts him at ease about that. This is why I'm saying to you, I don't have all of the answers, I think, to every scenario that is presented from this text. But I see two main approaches to Jesus' statement here. That he's either stating the general rule of Leviticus chapter 24, and then in that case is encouraging a deeper examination of the law of Moses where these principles of mercy and compassion come into play. Or Jesus just might simply be affirming that what David did was wrong. You know, much like we've got Esau back in the book of Genesis who was convinced he was about to die of hunger. Was he? No. Could it be the same thing with David here? And Jesus is simply saying, look, what David did was wrong. But if you're going to get mad at my disciples for doing something that does not violate the law of Moses, when are you going to come around to addressing David who did violate the law of Moses? You see a point in either direction that gets then to what Jesus is talking about here. Let's read verses 27 and 28. 27, Mark chapter 2 and verse 27 serves then as our summary statement. He was saying to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Jeff, this is to your point that you were making earlier. The Sabbath was made for man. Why does God institute the Sabbath? For man's well-being. But how often do people decide they don't want to take use of that, and rather they want to go and line their pockets and abuse other people? And that's one of the protections that God builds into the law of Moses. Here, Stephen, yes, sir?
Luke comes at the same thing from a different direction. Jesus went around healing deliberately on the Sabbath.
Yes.
Because that gave relief to man. It's the same
Principle.
concept, and it just horrified the Pharisees. You know, there's 6 other days in the week when you can get healed. Jesus said, no, this is the true meaning of the Sabbath.
Exactly, which then is verse 28. Consequently, the Son of Man is Lord of what? He's Lord of the Sabbath. That doesn't mean that Jesus was at liberty to go and violate the Sabbath. That's not the point there. But who was the giver of the Sabbath law? Christ is there with God, right? This is the Godhead giving these laws. Jesus is the one who gave the law. Would Jesus know how to execute it and live under it properly? That's the point. So when Jesus absolves his disciples of doing wrong, what does that tell us? Snacking on the Sabbath was what? Permitted. Pulling a donkey out of the ditch was what? Okay. Healing on the Sabbath was what? Okay. Why? The Lord who made the Sabbath said it's okay. All right, we're picking up chapter 3 in Mark next week. Appreciate your good attention and comments.